When it comes to what people would do in the face of danger, some might say they'd run, others say they'd fight back, and some might imagine they'd be willing to take a life if it meant saving their own. On its surface, the question of self defense seems simple. However, understanding when an action turns from self defense into something else is something that has been and will continue to be debated across the world. Hi, I'm Cam,
And I'm Dev.
and you're listening to Criminalish, a true crime podcast where two best friends trade stories ranging from the wild and wacky to the downright messed up. So, Dev, today I'm going to be talking about the murders of Nick Brady and Haile Kifer that took place in Little Falls, Minnesota in November 2012. Have you heard of this case before?
Potentially, the names and location are sounding familiar, but I don't know if I'm confusing this with another case. I know we typically focus on cases that are lesser known, which is why I think I might be potentially confusing it, but I'm going to give a soft no.
Okay. I will say this case is infamous for Little Falls, but Little Falls is a very small town. And I will say too, even if you have heard of this case, I think the discussion that we'll have regarding the trial and some of the legal arguments will still be very interesting.
Okay, sounds great to me, friend. But before you start telling me about all the great discussion you think we're going to have, what we drinking today?
So today we are drinking something very similar to what we were drinking on our last episode. And if you're watching on YouTube, you may notice that we're also wearing things very similar to what we were wearing on the last episode. And that may or may not be because we are recording them together. So in the last episode, Dev made a really great mocktail that had sparkling ice with some lemon and lime juice and some blackberries on top. I unknowingly also brought sparkling ice for our drink today, but I changed it up a little bit. So I basically mixed two flavors, the kiwi strawberry and the black raspberry together, threw some lemon juice in there and put some ice in there. And we got ourselves a nice little mocktail.
Sounds good to me, friend.
And cheers.
I like it.
Lemon juice brings out that acidity, little tartness. So, our story starts in the small town of Little Falls, Minnesota. In 2012, the town had just over 8,000 people, according to the 2010 census, taking up less than 10 square miles. It's about a 1.5 hour drive north of Minneapolis, the state capital. And with 8,000 people, you can imagine this is a place where everyone knew everyone and pretty much everything about everyone. However, a string of robberies in late 2012 had left many in this community feeling on edge. One such member was a man named Byron Smith. Byron Smith, born June 11, 1948, was a native of Little Falls, Minnesota. However, he did not stay in the area. He worked for the State Department, and through this work, he'd seen many places like Moscow and Cairo, just many places around the world. His work focused on technical security for U.S. embassies, like understanding building layouts and alarm systems. And he was described by friends as someone who was quiet and soft-spoken, but fun to talk with. Around 2007, he moved back to Little Falls to live out his retirement. And at this point, he lived alone. And according to friends, he'd seemed off in the past few months, and this was because he'd been one of the victims of multiple break-ins where the thieves had taken cash and priceless things like family heirlooms, as well as two of his guns. So, of course, he was feeling on edge and scared because his guns had been taken.
Of course. And who knows what they're going to do with that and what's going to be linked back to you potentially.
Right. Neither police nor Byron knew at the time that at least one of the culprits of these break-ins were two teens. One of those, Nick Brady, was born on March 21st, 1995 in Randall, Minnesota, to his parents, Jason and Kimberly, and he had one sister. At 17 years old, Nick was a junior at a nearby school and was involved in sports like wrestling and taekwondo, as well as other outdoorsy things and adventurous things. The other teen was Haile Kifer, who was born on October 17th, 1994, in Little Falls to her parents, Jay and Jenny, and she had one brother. At 18 years old, Haley was a senior in high school and was also involved in sports like gymnastics, softball, wrestling, and cross country. And according to her obituary, on top of being into sports, she liked spending time with family and friends and doing outdoorsy things like hunting and fishing. Now, these teens sound very similar, and that was because they were very close, and on top of that, they were cousins, first cousins at that. They were both described by their family as being fun loving and close to their other family members. Now, the day before Thanksgiving, Nick and Haley were hanging out with Nick's sister, just driving around Little Falls because there wasn't much to do for teenagers there. They'd spent the night at their friend's apartment, and Nick and Haley left around 11 a.m. that morning. They'd planned to meet up later at their grandma's house, but when they didn't show up, Nick's sister called him and Haley continuously to no avail. And I said this in the last episode, you said this in the last episode too. It wasn't like them to not answer. Nick's sister even said that it might take her a couple of times to reach him, but eventually he would answer and be like, "What do you want?" And Haley, she was the type of person that it did not take multiple times calling to reach her, especially for her cousin that she was very close to. So at this point, it had also started snowing. It's Minnesota, it's November, so it's snowing pretty hard. And their family is thinking maybe they got stranded somewhere or got into an accident. And Nick's sister, Rachel, even posted on Facebook asking if anyone had heard anything from Nick or Haley. However, the next day, that Friday, after Thanksgiving, a police officer and chaplain would come to Nick's mom's house and tell her that her son and Haley had been found dead from multiple gunshot wounds. On top of this horrifying news, the officer would tell Nick's mom that they'd been killed by a man after breaking into his home.
Oh my God. My immediate reaction is just kind of confusion. I understand, like, it's a small town, there's not much to do there. So sometimes, like, kids get into stupid crimes to give themselves something to do, right? But it seems so weird for them to get into breaking into homes based on the context of, like, what they were doing. Like, they're both student athletes, they're in school. It kind of seems odd to me. So I'm immediately just confused about
Yeah.
this whole scenario.
And I'll say too, for Nick's mom, especially because she's given a lot of interviews, she was also shocked by this at first. She didn't think that her son was doing those kinds of things. But she was also very much willing to hear out the evidence that they had against him, the evidence that they had to prove that he'd done this. So the man who shot them, the man whose home they'd broken into, was Byron Smith, the man that I mentioned earlier. And that Friday morning, a sergeant had responded to a break-in complaint from Byron. And when the sergeant pulls up to the house, Byron comes out with his hands above his head. He says that he needs to show the sergeant something in his bedroom, and as he leads him into there, he points them to a broken window, specifically broken glass on his desk and floor, making it clear that someone had smashed it from the outside. He then takes the sergeant down to the basement and shows him the two bodies that were laying on the ground on top of tarp. It was clear to police that these bodies had been moved and almost piled on top of each other. And it was also clear that these two people, eventually determined to be Nick and Haley, had multiple gunshot wounds. Byron handed over the guns he'd used to the police, and he told police that he'd been in his reading chair in his basement when two people broke into his house, and he shot and killed them in self-defense.
Oh yeah, we're going to have some discussion here because I got way too many thoughts and opinions already.
Yeah, and I'm going to ask you to wait until we get to the trial because there are things that will come out, and I want you to have this discussion with all the information at your disposal.
Oh, I figured, friend, knowing you, you love to play tricks on me with these cases, so I'm going to sit here and wait.
So, as police began investigating the crime, his claims of self-defense initially seemed to check out. He had surveillance cameras that he'd set up, and these cameras showed Nick walking up to the house just after 12:30 and looking into the windows as if he were checking to see if someone were home. Nick has a hood on and is clearly trying to conceal his face and even tries to take down one of the cameras. He leaves the view of the camera where you can hear him breaking the bedroom window and most likely entering the home. A few minutes later, Haile enters the camera frame carrying a purse and cell phone. As investigators are doing this investigation, they discovered that it was likely Nick and a friend who had broken into Byron's house a month before and stolen thousands in cash, family heirlooms, and those 2 guns. I couldn't get confirmation on how they were able to link this, but I do believe one of the pieces of evidence was a shoe print that was matched to the shoes that Nick was wearing. Also, when they searched Nick's car, they found prescription pills that Nick had stolen from another house and linked this to a burglary that had happened just the day before. When talking to Byron, he described feeling on edge after this break-in and not being able to sleep and feeling like whoever stole from him was going to come back and kill him with his own gun. However, the police would find that both Nick and Haile were unarmed when they entered. Now, while it is clear that Nick and Haile broke into Byron's home, a couple of things are standing out to investigators. For one, this murder happened the day before, on Thursday, but Byron waited a full day to call the police. And when they asked him why he didn't call, Byron said that he first thought that the woman was his neighbor and didn't know if her parents would come looking for her, and he didn't want to bother the police on Thanksgiving Day. In looking at the basement, they also noticed that the light bulbs had been screwed out of the ceiling, making it so that whoever was coming down to the basement would not be able to see what was around them. Now, it's clear at this point that police need to dig in deeper. At the very least, Byron has killed 2 people, and they need to determine what really happened here. So, they read him his Miranda rights and take him into the police station for more questions on that same day. During this questioning, Byron again goes into how he'd been scared for his life because of the previous break-ins. He explained that morning he'd been in the basement when he first saw Nick come down the stairs. He then shot him 3 times. A few minutes after he shot Nick, Haile came downstairs and he shot her too. He said that he initially thought she was dead, but when he realized she wasn't, he gave her a, quote, clean finishing shot, end quote. He was described by investigators as being mostly calm and matter-of-fact when describing the shootings. Another thing that investigators noticed was that his car wasn't out front. He told investigators that he'd moved his car down the road to clean his garage. But investigators found this odd, especially because he walked back up to his house and entered from the backyard, which faced a river, instead of entering from the front door, which would have been facing the street. After this questioning, Byron was arrested and charged with second-degree murder, but later released on bond. Now, investigators still feel like something isn't adding up about this case. And as they looked further into it, they would find something that would answer a lot of their open questions: an audio recorder that had captured the entire ordeal. It had more than 6 hours of audio from this day, and Byron hadn't mentioned this to investigators. I will say at least a portion of this audio recording is available online, but I won't be linking it since you can hear Nick and Haile's deaths in the recording. But I will summarize it. I will give a quick trigger warning as I am about to go into detail about the final moments of 2 people's lives. So if that will be unsettling for you, I would recommend skipping forward about 45 seconds to a minute and a half. But we will put the exact timestamps in the description. So this recording starts about 5 to 10 minutes before Nick is shot. And in this portion, Byron is mumbling to himself and seemingly practicing asking his brother to come by and asking for a lawyer. He says, quote, "I realize I don't have an appointment, but I'd like to see one of the lawyers here," end quote. Reminder, this is before he shoots Nick and Haile. It's also in this portion that he says, quote, "in the left eye," end quote, which investigators focus on since Haile was shot in her left eye. You then hear glass breaking from Nick breaking into the house, and a minute or so later, you hear 2 shots fire in quick succession. You hear Nick grunting in pain, and then a 3rd shot. After shooting Nick, Byron says, quote, "you're dead," end quote. You can then hear a rustling sound that police believe is Byron unfolding the tarp that he used to move Nick's body out of the way. You then hear Byron reload his gun and breathing heavily. About 10 minutes later, you hear Haile come into the home and whisper Nick's name, trying to call out to him. You hear a single shot ring out, and Haile likely fall to the ground. Byron's gun then jams, and you hear him say, quote, "sorry about that," end quote, before firing additional shots into her. All the while, she is screaming and saying, quote, "oh my God," end quote, while Byron says, quote, "you're dying," end quote. This part was also interesting to investigators because Byron told them that Haile had laughed at him when his gun jammed, which further triggered him. But this clearly was not the case. After he shoots Haile, he calls her a bitch. Based on the recording, this entire ordeal went down in 12 minutes. The recording then continued for another 5 hours, catching Byron saying things like, quote, "I am not a bleeding heart liberal. I felt like I was cleaning up a mess, not like spilled food, not like vomit, not even like diarrhea. The worst mess possible, and I was stuck with it," end quote. Quote, in some tiny little respect, I was doing my civic duty. If the law enforcement system couldn't handle it, I had to do it. End quote. Quote, "They weren't human. I don't see them as human. I see them as vermin. Social mistakes, social problems. I don't see them as human. This bitch was going to go through her life, destroying things for other people, thieving, robbing, drug use." End quote. And quote, "Mother and father are both semi-psychotic. I put even odds that one or the other will come over here with a gun." End quote. And on top of this recording, as investigators look into the scene, it seemed like Byron had set up the basement to lie in wait. In addition to his weapons, he had a book, snacks, a bottle of water, and a screen connected to his outdoor camera showing a live feed of the security footage. It didn't seem like he targeted Nick and Haile specifically, but he'd set the scene for somebody to break into his house and for him to catch who that was and execute them. And I'm not exactly sure when this came into the investigation, but one of the court documents mentioned that he'd actually suspected that one of his neighbors was responsible and that she and her parents were watching his house to keep track of when he came and went. So that also sort of explains why he thought Haile was that neighbor. She was a young woman, and why he might have thought that the parents might come after her. So now I'm going to get into a bit of the community reaction and the lead up to the trial. But Dev, I'm sure you have thoughts.
Oh, I have several. And some of them might get answered through a course of a trial. But my immediate reaction is Byron planned to kill somebody that day. I do agree that I don't think he was specifically looking to kill Nick or Haile, but he was content to kill somebody that day. And that is sick. And what I can't get over is after you killed somebody, claiming self-defense, claiming that they broke into your house, which fair enough, you took all the steps of a murderer, not as somebody who committed self-defense. I have seen cases of somebody has broken into somebody's house and they opened fire on them. One, they sent a warning shot and that person didn't listen. Thus, they opened fire on this young man and the young man was killed. But that man immediately called the police. That man interacted in a way that was very obvious that he was in danger. And Byron is not giving, "Oh, I'm in danger." Byron is giving, "I'm angry, I'm vindictive, and somebody's going to pay. And the next person who comes into my house is going to pay." Right. And I'm actually setting up because I know for a fact if somebody thinks I'm not home, they'll break into my house. So you laid in wait and set somebody up with the intention of killing them.
Exactly.
And that is so bone chilling and creepy to me. And I guess the next set of my questions, and hopefully they'll be answered, but it's okay if they can't be. What the hell was the recording for? Why record this instance and then not only you recorded it, but then your statement to police doesn't line up with what's in the recording? That's insanity to me. And I'm also curious as to when you first started going through his statements, the first thing I wondered was, did police pull his phone records? And was he potentially on the phone with somebody and talking to them when he was talking about how it's just a mess that I have to deal with? Because to me, that sounds like if I was complaining about like life or something, I'd be on the phone with you and be like, "Girl, you're not going to believe the crap that Atreus just put me through today." Mm-hmm. That's what it sounded like. It sounded like I'm on the phone complaining to somebody about what I've done. Now, I don't have any evidence of that, but that was just my immediate reaction of like, is he talking to somebody? Does somebody else already know that he did this? And we're going to go ahead and address the next big point too. I know plenty of liberals who are armed. I know plenty of liberals who, if you broke through their front door, they would open fire on you.
Right.
I know plenty of...
Kamala Harris said it herself.
Come on now.
Yeah.
So I also find it interesting that we make this a political thing of like, I'm not no liberal. I'm not no weak liberal. I know some liberals who will open fire on that ass if they needed to.
And in response to a couple of your points, so we don't know why he had this recording for sure. I will speculate and say that it seems like part of him took joy in this. And if anything, I speculate that the recording was taken for his personal enjoyment.
I completely agree with you because it sounds like some sick satisfaction kind of thing.
Exactly.
And though I was very sympathetic to Byron in the beginning, people stole your family heirlooms, people stole your money, people stole your guns. That's terrifying. But you move their bodies. Again, if this is a case of self-defense, you're moving people's bodies, which also says to me, you knew that there was more than one person. Because according to the recording, you shot him, moved the body so that presumably the next person to come down the stairs wouldn't trip or see the other person and be able to run away. So it's again this setup. It just feels like this thought out setup that doesn't sit right with me.
Yeah, and another interesting thing that police asked him was, did you see that they were armed? And in both cases, Byron had not seen their hands by the time that he shot them. So you can essentially think of it as he is lying in wait in the basement and he sees Nick's feet, legs, hip. And as soon as he sees the hip, that's when he shoots. But in neither of those instances had he seen that they were armed.
That's a fair point. But also, to give a mouse a cookie, you don't have to. That person is an uninvited guest in your house and they've clearly broken in.
Yeah.
So they don't have to be armed for them to be dangerous, in all honesty.
It was just something that police asked him in both cases just to get an understanding of his mindset.
Absolutely.
And I can't say for sure whether or not police pulled the phone records and compared it to that time period, but that didn't come up at all in the trial. And so I do think that he was just mumbling to himself and talking to himself for that entire hours-long period.
Interesting. Ooh, that actually makes another point that I'm really curious about. Don't tell me if I'm right, because if I were a betting woman and I had that, and this dude's just kind of out here mumbling to himself to nobody, is he mumbling to nobody? Does he think he's mumbling to nobody? And do we have a defense that's like, my man was a little off? Is it giving insanity defense? I don't know. I'm just, as soon as you said that was something I was thinking, because I was like, I smell an insanity defense coming.
Let's go ahead and get into some of the community reaction and trial then.
Mm-hmm.
So the small community of Little Falls was pretty divided on this case. On one hand, many people believed that a homeowner had the right to do what was necessary to defend their home. But on the other hand, the prosecution argued that what Byron did went well beyond self-defense and described him as a cold-blooded killer. Also, keep in mind that at this point, before the trial, the audio recording had not been released. So many people did not know the details of this crime. And in Minnesota, specifically, you have a right to defend your life, home, and property as long as it's reasonable. Minnesota's castle doctrine stipulates that a person must satisfy certain requirements before they can justify self-defense. 1, they can't be the aggressor. 2, they must believe that the situation posed, quote, imminent danger of bodily harm, end quote. 3, their fear is based on a reasonable read of the situation. And 4, they did not have the opportunity to retreat from the situation. And on April 25th, 2013, Byron Smith was indicted by a grand jury on 2 counts of first-degree murder. In Minnesota, to bring a first-degree murder charge against someone, they have to first be indicted by a grand jury. So this was the precursor to bringing him to a trial for the first-degree murder charges.
Interesting. But I'm not going to lie, my immediate reaction was, y'all really going to go for first degree? I don't know if that's going to work in your favor, but y'all really going to go for first degree? If y'all really want to go for first degree, that feels a little aggressive. Not because I don't think it's right. I actually do think it's the right charge, but I don't know if the evidence is going to work with you for first degree. I think second degree was the right call. But either way, I'm not a prosecutor. I'm not a lawyer. I am a girl on the internet who enjoys true crime. But also what I find really interesting is the castle doctrine requires you to have to retreat.
It requires that you did not have the opportunity to retreat. And this is actually something that they are trying to get changed in the House of Representatives right now, is to loosen or take away that requirement.
Yeah, because I know there is a lot of states, prime example, Florida. I'm the most familiar with Florida. I live there. A lot of cases that fall into the self-defense argument are going to be in Florida because it has stand your ground. But in Florida, you have zero duty to retreat at all. If you feel like you're in danger, and especially if somebody broke into your house, you have full right to use deadly force, and you don't have to retreat from anything.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting to me that they do require you needed to make an attempt to retreat, or that retreat had to be an option.
Right.
I find that very interesting.
So the trial would begin in April of 2014. Like I said, the prosecution was arguing that Byron Smith was a cold-blooded killer. And to convict Byron on the first-degree murder charges, they would need to prove both premeditation and that Byron acted with, quote, excessive and unreasonable force, end quote. They claimed that he was not a hero, as many in the community thought, but a violent man looking to confront people he felt had wronged him. They stated that he'd set a trap for Nick and Haile by making them think he wasn't home while he was really lying in wait in the basement. They specifically brought up the fact that he'd moved his truck down the road to make it look like he wasn't home and unscrewed the light bulbs so that they wouldn't be able to see him. They brought into evidence the audio recordings that Byron had made, proving that he laid in wait in preparation for a break-in. They played the entire 12-minute ordeal, but warned Nick and Haile's family that they may not want to hear it. Their families decided to stay because they wanted to hear the whole story. Up to this point, they weren't sure what was true and what wasn't. It was clear that Nick and Haile had broken in, and so they were very willing to accept the self-defense argument from Byron. And as they played this recording, of course, it was an emotional moment for Nick and Haile's families, but Byron was also seen wiping away tears. On top of the audio recording, a medical examiner testified that the initial gunshot wounds caused serious injury but did not immediately kill Nick and Haile. Nick was shot 3 times in his abdomen, the back of his left shoulder, and his right temple, with the bullet going through his right hand. 2 of Haile's gunshot wounds that ended up being fatal were to her head and at close range. The defense, on the other hand, argued that Byron's actions were in self-defense and that he was a man acting out of fear to defend his life and home. They said the recording didn't prove that he was a cold-blooded murderer, but rather a man who'd lost his mind. Unfortunately for the defense, the judge did not allow evidence that Nick was responsible for the previous break-ins to come into court, but the defense was allowed to bring up the break-ins without saying who was responsible. The judge essentially said that at the time of the murder, Byron didn't know that Nick was responsible, so it's not relevant to this case. One of Byron's neighbors testified for the defense that after a previous break-in, Byron had come to their house and seemed very shaken up. The defense also brought up that Byron had sent a memo to the police department at the end of October asking them to investigate the break-ins and questioned why the police hadn't made any progress on this request. In his closing argument, Byron's lawyers said that Nick and Haile would still be alive today if they hadn't broken into Byron's home, and that all of Byron's actions were in the pursuit of self-defense. He also argued that since the previous shots to Nick and Haile weren't fatal nor incapacitating, they could have hypothetically moved and still posed a threat to Byron. After a week of trial, the jury went to deliberate, and after less than 4 hours, they found Byron Smith guilty on 2 counts of first-degree and 2 counts of second-degree murder. Byron was sentenced to 2 concurrent life sentences without the possibility of parole.
Interesting. I do find it interesting that the defense did teeter. They did play around with the idea of not guilty by insanity, but they didn't commit.
Right.
And that's a problem for me. If you gon' commit, you got to commit. If my man is crazy, commit and say he's crazy. Also, side note, because I was told this recently, I distinguish actual mental illness from crazy. Crazy to me is not real. Mental illness is real. Because I had somebody bring that up because I said this person was acting crazy. And they were like, that's insensitive. And I was like, no, because I understand that mental illness is mental illness. This person's acting crazy. There is
out of pocket.
Exactly. But caveat out of the way, I'm a little surprised, in all honesty, because I didn't think that the prosecution was going to get first-degree murder. And I thought it would be hard to prove first degree. And maybe the law is a little bit different in Minnesota. But most of the time, if you're going to seek first degree, you have to connect the murder to that specific person. And I didn't think that they would be able to connect first degree to Nick specifically and to Haile specifically. But maybe the laws are different up there. Obviously, I don't question the jury's verdict on that. I'm pleasantly surprised by the first degree murder conviction because I think it is accurate. I do think it is accurate. And agree that this man lied in wait for two people to come into his house. I also think what is really interesting, and I didn't bring it up before, but it reminded me as you were talking about the trial, he himself admitted that Haile specifically wasn't dead and that he made a separate conscious act to kill her. That's when it became first degree.
Right.
Her specifically, absolutely. The moment he was like, oh, you're not dead yet, I'm going to kill you now, that's first degree. I don't know if the same thing happened with Nick, but Haile for sure is super easy to prove.
Yeah, I don't know the specifics of the first degree charge, but I do know prosecution had to prove that it was premeditated and that he used excessive force. I don't know if they had to prove that it was premeditated for that specific person, but I think what was clear, especially with the audio recording, which was really a smoking gun in this case, was that he was ready to kill somebody.
Exactly.
He had premeditated killing somebody, especially when you hear him saying things like in the left eye and then shooting somebody in their left eye. And then you hear him practicing asking for a lawyer before he's even killed anybody. You know that he is ready to take somebody's life. And then on top of this, seeing the way in which he talks about them, calling them vermin. Even in the interrogation with investigators, he says that the final shot to Haile was to put her out of her misery. But then he talks about how she had a death twitch and he'd only ever seen that in animals before, but humans have the same one. Just very creepy comments, and comments both in the audio recording and in the interrogation with investigators where he's comparing them to animals, showing that he didn't see them as humans. Now, I don't want the perception to be that we are signing off on robbery, because we're not. It is dangerous. It can quickly escalate into somebody losing their life. And even if you don't, even if you're robbed when you're not home, you do still feel a sense of loss and a lack of safety because someone has encroached into your home. But I don't think there's any place in the US where you are sentenced to death after being convicted of robbery. Because although it can be a violent crime, it does not meet the bar of somebody deserving death, especially I think with two teenagers. And I'm not exactly sure why they were robbing homes. I don't know if it was thrill seeking, if they thought it was easy money, or what. But I do think that this is a case where they could have been rehabilitated. If they were caught and did time, I think that they could have very well come out of this learning from their mistakes.
Absolutely. But also, in that same vein, kind of on the other side of the coin, if somebody breaks into your house and you respond with appropriate deadly force, I don't think you're in the wrong either.
No.
You have a right to defend your household because for the same reasons that you're saying, your household has been violated when that person broke into your home, whether they took your belongings, whether they just laid in wait and did creepy stuff around your house, even if nothing was stolen. Your privacy and your safety has been violated.
Right.
And you have a right to that. So in that same vein, while I don't think that burglary is a sentence for death, if that is a result and it is appropriate result, the person who did the shooting or killing or protecting of the household is not in the wrong either. But for the same reasons that you're saying, but if that person has just broken into homes for thrill seeking and everything else, and they're not armed and they're not actively trying to hurt people, I do think there's a level of we can go get them and rehabilitate them. Because again, at the end of the day too, they were breaking into homes that they thought were empty. So clearly they weren't looking for confrontations with people. They weren't looking to hurt people. They were probably, like you were saying, looking to grab some money and grab some expensive stuff and get out.
Right. And two, one of the investigators said that you can't break into somebody's home and expect that you will leave alive, expect that you will leave with your life. At the same time, if somebody is arrested for burglary, they will not be sentenced to death. And I think that's the stipulation here, especially with this case. It's not just that people broke into Byron's home and he killed them in self-defense. He essentially lured them into his home, knowing that they would break in and knowing that he would be able to execute them. And I think that's really what is the line for a lot of people who are against what Byron did. There are still many people who support Byron even after hearing the recording. His neighbor and best friend is one of those. And he says, I don't feel bad at all for what he did to those kids. And he essentially says they had it coming. They deserve this. While on the other hand, you have Nick and Haley's families, while they contend that what their children did was wrong, they essentially see it as Byron butchering their children.
I completely agree with the families. And I think it's very interesting for the best friend to have that stance, because here's also the thing too. It's not just that he lured them into the basement and killed them and, in my opinion, executed these two children. It's all the movements afterwards. He also, what were you doing with their bodies for 24 hours?
He claimed that he was laying in wait for more people and that he didn't want to bother the police officers.
We know the latter is some horse, but the former, I do believe. I believe that he was like, I'm going to get as many people as I can.
I think that it really was his mindset that there were more people coming and he had to wait them out. And also that morning, he actually went to his neighbor first to see if his neighbor knew any lawyers. So I really think he was going to wait overnight. And then that next morning, he was going to try and get a lawyer before calling the police, but he wasn't able to do that. And so just ended up calling the police. But I think his original plan was to find a lawyer Friday morning and then go to the police. But since he wasn't able to find a lawyer, he called the police first, or had his neighbor call the police is actually what happened.
So I can agree with what you're saying completely, but that's just never going to sit right with me. You killed two people allegedly in self-defense and then waited 24 hours for your friend to call the cops.
Exactly. But like you said, in cases where it has been self-defense clear cut, those people are typically calling the police immediately. And I'm sure even in those cases, those people are like, what did I do? I just took somebody's life. But even when he's telling investigators about what happened, he's very matter of fact. And I don't always like to read into that too much, because just because somebody is coming off as calm, cool, and collected doesn't mean that that's a reflection of how they're feeling internally. Especially, I think a lot of men are trying to put up this wall and seem impenetrable and unemotional. So I'm not reading too much into that, but just some of his subsequent comments also show that he didn't really have remorse for the situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, another point of self-defense that I can't believe I forgot because we covered it on the podcast, Susan. When Susan had to kill that man who was going to kill her, she ran out of the house. She did run to her neighbor's house and she was like, call the police immediately.
Right.
And she still thought that maybe a paramedic might be able to save him.
Right.
And she even gave him a chance. And she was like, if you just leave, I won't kill you. And even then, she had to kill him. So, yeah, I hate this man. This man is gross. This man is weird. This man is crazy. But one thing that I was super, super pleasantly surprised by, which is Nick and Haley's families gave space for Byron to be in the right. They wanted to hear all sides. I've seen cases where, unfortunately, they have been killed as a result of a burglary or something like that. And the family is adamant that they did nothing wrong, that they were completely innocent, and that other person was completely out of line for doing what they did, blah, 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 blah. Even though the circumstances couldn't be further from what they were saying. And I think it takes a lot of courage to do that. It takes a lot of courage to sit and face the possibility that your children were in the wrong.
Right.
That your children did something that directly resulted in their death. And I think that's very big of the family to take that approach, to have space for maybe our kids are in the wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe Byron did what he had to do.
Right.
But also in that same vein, I feel like it hurts a little bit more when you find out that what happened to your children is actually worse than what you thought, because they weren't killed immediately. There was a suffering. There was a fear. And Byron took pleasure in that, in my opinion.
Yeah. The comments, you're dying, you're dead, it definitely seemed like he took pleasure in that. And I'll also note too, I do want to hold space for Byron's supporters and some of the sentiment that they might have, because for them, I'm sure what they're hearing is, oh, we care more about the thieves and the robbers than we care about your life. Or if you choose to protect yourself, you need to make sure you do it in the right way. And while I think that sentiment is valid, and that is what they feel, I think that it misses the point of Byron's case, which is that he, one, treated these people like they were not human. He literally called them vermin. And two, he sought out to kill them. He made himself cop, judge, jury, and executioner. And that is what doesn't fly here. We've talked about other cases where people have defended themselves in their home, and it's been proven that it was clear-cut self-defense. But in this case, there is just too much evidence pointing to the fact that he expected somebody to break into his home. He made it seem like he was not home, thereby luring them in. And in the Minnesota state law sense, he made no effort to retreat. For example, he could have said, "Hey, I'm in here, I'm armed," or fired off a warning shot to scare them away. And he had footage from the security, so he knew that there weren't 5, 6 people coming into his home. He knew exactly how many people were in his home.
And that part, the part you just mentioned, is the bit for me. Because also, you had security footage and you knew they broke in. You didn't want justice. You didn't want somebody to go to jail for breaking into your house. You wanted to kill somebody. Because in that same vein, if he had been like, "Hey, I'm here, I'm armed, and I got you on video," those 2 kids would have ran out of that house.
Right.
And then he could have taken that footage to the police and gotten those 2 kids arrested and gotten them put in jail. For
Exactly.
sure. Because that is a appropriate remedy. For sure. And that's the problem. He didn't want justice for a break-in. He wanted to kill somebody.
Yeah.
He wanted somebody to feel pain and suffering.
Exactly.
And then the other thing I want to address is same thing to his supporters. And our stance on this, I am all for protect your home. I think I've made it very clear throughout the entire length of this podcast that you have a right to protect yourself, your home, your property, your animals. You have a right to do that. But factually, there is a right and a wrong way to do that. It just is. You do not get to lure people into your house so that you can kill them. That doesn't become self-defense. That becomes a plan.
Right. And not to take away from the seriousness of this, but it reminds me of that movie where I think the guy is blind or something, and there's these people that break into his home and he ends up being like a torturer or something. This reminded me a lot of that.
Yeah, Don't Breathe. Side note, there's 2 of them. Those are very good movies. But I do think that movie is a good example of this. I will say one caveat, though, is at least in that movie, the blind man did have a gun pulled on him before he started doing all his crazy stuff. We're not going to act like the main character of Don't Breathe is not crazy and evil and doing horrible things and torturing people in his basement. We're not going to act like that didn't happen. But the initial confrontation, the initial killing happened after a gun was pulled on him. So even then, he has more justification for killing the other 2 men in that movie than Byron did for killing these 2 children.
Right.
One, they were unarmed. Yes, they broke into your house, but they're unarmed. You didn't give them a chance to retreat. And we know for a fact that they never threatened you. Of course, they broke into your house. That is a threat. But there is no reason to believe that they would have killed or harmed you.
Right. So, in the aftermath of the trial, Nick and Haley's families were satisfied with the decision, but of course still distraught that they'd lost their loved ones. However, Byron's supporters felt that the trial was unfair and that key evidence in his defense had been left out. According to Byron's best friend and neighbor, Byron didn't think that he'd be found guilty and thought that the law would be on his side. He stayed with him while he awaited trial, and the friend said that despite his seemingly calm demeanor, Byron was very sad at the prospect of losing his freedom and the life he'd built, and he would hear him crying, saying, quote, "I'm so sorry this happened. I didn't mean for this to happen. Why'd it happen to me? Why'd it happen to me?" End quote. And the friend said, quote, all he wanted was peace and quiet, live on the river, fix up his mom and dad's place. He didn't want none of this crap. End quote. And the friend said that in prison, Byron was actually getting a lot of respect from prisoners for what he did.
You know, the part that's the most interesting to me is that everything you said about how Byron felt is all about him. I'm sorry this is happening to me. I thought the law was going to be on my side. So if you knew the law wasn't going to be on your side, would you have called or reported their bodies at all?
Exactly. And I think it goes back to the fact that he and his supporters don't think that he did anything wrong. They think that those teens got what they deserved for breaking into his home.
I genuinely don't understand how you could have that thought and feeling when it's provable that this isn't self-defense. You cannot lay in wait and set a trap for somebody and they die as a result and you get away with it. That's not how this works.
But I think there's people who are not viewing it from the legal sense. They're viewing it from, oh, if you choose to come up in my house, you deserve whatever's coming for you, no matter when I choose to mete out that punishment.
And that's fine. Like, you can have that stance, but it's just factually inaccurate. I have the stance of, if somebody were to break in my house right now, I'm going to do what I have to do because it's always me over them.
Mm-hmm.
But you know what I'm not doing? I'm not sitting on my back porch, gun loaded, waiting for somebody, leaving my front door unlocked and cracked open so that somebody will walk in.
Exactly.
I genuinely don't understand at all how you can act like that was an appropriate response. Again, if he was sitting in his living room, car parked in the driveway, and they broke in his house and they knew he was home and they were looking for a confrontation, yeah, they got what was coming to them.
Or even sitting in his living room, they break into his house, he shoots them, they run off.
Got what was coming to them. Those are circumstances of which he did not create and facilitate a desire to kill somebody.
Yeah.
Also, another thing, you're getting a lot of respect in prison.
From the same vermin that you claim to hate.
Especially if you're in prison, that means you've been convicted. So you did that, whatever it is. But, you know, now that the vermin are on his side, the vermin are important.
Yeah, it was just silly. But Byron and his lawyers, of course, would appeal his conviction. His first appeal came in March of 2016. In it, Byron and his lawyers argued 4 things. 1, the court should have dismissed the initial grand jury indictment that indicted him on the first-degree murder charges. This was based on a few things. He said that the jury voted on the proposed indictment, but not the final indictment, and that the language was different between the two. However, the appeals court found that the two were not substantially different enough to justify throwing out the indictment, and that the prosecution had given sufficient instruction on the indictment language. He also said that during this grand jury indictment, the prosecution improperly questioned his witness, brought up his second-degree murder charge, and did not properly distinguish between first and second-degree murder. However, the appeals court found that neither of these had undue influence on the grand jury's decision due to the overwhelming evidence. They did concur that the prosecution's questioning likely was inappropriate, but did not have an undue effect. And on the point about the second-degree murder charges, they disagreed with him. Essentially, one of the jurors asked about the second-degree murder charge, and the prosecution gave an answer about the legal language and its connection to Byron's case. So the question was prompted by a juror, and the appeals court found that the prosecution answered the question sufficiently.
I have a question because I'm a little confused. What witness was talking about first and second degree murder? I'm confused about who that is.
Sorry, this is all in one thing. So he said that the prosecution acted improperly in 3 ways. 1, that they improperly questioned his witness. Essentially, they were badgering his neighbor with multiple questions. 2, aside from questioning the witness, the way that they answered the juror's question about the second-degree murder charge was improper because they basically stated that he had been charged with second-degree murder. And 3, they did not properly distinguish between first and second-degree murder. So this is all his complaint about the prosecution's argument.
Okay. So that was my confusion because I was like, what witness? Because that's what I was like, not understanding. But if it's the neighbor, I can understand that. Especially because the neighbor is by definition against this whole prosecution anyway.
Right. So yeah, but it was 3 separate instances.
Got it.
That he's complaining about, but generally complaining about the prosecution during the grand jury indictment.
Got it.
And lastly, he argued that during the grand jury indictment, quote unquote, spark of life evidence brought by the testimony of Nick and Haile's mothers shouldn't have been allowed. This is essentially them testifying, saying how great of people Nick and Haile were. However, the appeals court argued that since this evidence is allowable in criminal trials, it is also allowable in grand jury testimony. And again, it did not cause undue prejudice against the defendant.
Exactly, because the defense can also make the same argument. They can call the neighbor and talk about how great of a person Byron was. It's character evidence. Character evidence is not a problem.
Exactly. As long as it doesn't cause prejudice against the defendant in an undue manner.
Exactly.
So the appeals court disagreed with his first argument that the district court should have dismissed the grand jury indictment. His second argument was that his Sixth Amendment right had been violated when the court briefly closed proceedings to speakers and the media. The Sixth Amendment right gives you a right to a public trial. This closure specifically happened when the court was discussing whether evidence of Nick's involvement in previous break-ins and testimony from his friends would be admissible. So the judge had decided not to allow this evidence because, like I said before, Byron didn't know at the time that Nick was the one responsible for the break-ins. And since previous discussions about this topic had included the names of Nick's friends and the judge did not want this to be printed by the media, he closed this part of the trial to the public. And this was essentially a short period that happened after the jury had been selected, but before they'd taken their final oath. And so the appeals court determined that this closed discussion was a follow-up to an administrative proceeding and did not meet the bar for a Sixth Amendment violation.
I agree with that. And then also, presumably, all those kids are minors anyway, so why do their names need to be in the public docket? Exactly. If those same minors were accused of an actual crime, it would be a sealed proceeding.
Exactly. And they're choosing not to even have them testify in the trial.
Exactly. So it's not relevant at all.
So again, the appeals court disagreed with him on the fact that his Sixth Amendment right had been violated. His third argument was that his constitutional right to a fair trial was violated when the court decided to exclude certain evidence. Specifically, they excluded witness testimony on prior burglaries at Byron's house, evidence related to a shotgun taken during one of these burglaries, testimony from an expert witness on critical incident stress, and evidence linking Nick Brady to a previous burglary. Essentially, on the first item, the witness testimony about prior burglaries, the court did allow certain testimony, but they basically just drew a line and they were like, okay, this testimony doesn't add anything else to this case. On the shotgun, what they allowed was a picture of the shotgun that had been taken, and the defense wanted to bring in the actual shotgun, but the court was basically like, it's a shotgun, it's clear that it's a deadly weapon, we don't need to actually bring in the shotgun. And the expert witness's testimony on critical incident stress, she was basically going to testify that Byron was experiencing critical incident stress after shooting Nick, and that he sort of wasn't in his right mind. And that with that stressful period he was going through, he didn't hear Haile come in, and so shot her more in reaction as part of this stress period he was going through. However, the judge decided not to allow this because the evidence against this was too overwhelming, especially on him hearing Haile come in, because you can hear Haile on the recording, and also with the way that he responded, it was clear that he'd known she was inside the home. So in summary, the appeals court pretty much agreed with the exclusions that the district court had decided, and noted that even where it didn't agree, the district court's error in excluding evidence would not constitute a reversal of Byron's conviction because the evidence against him was so overwhelming.
I also agree. I do think there might have been some potential of maybe the judge should have allowed that expert to speak, but I thought it was going to be in a different context. I thought they were going to try to use that to kind of explain away the mumbling and everything after both killings, which I think could have been a really good argument because the ramblings and the muttering is kind of like, bro, are you all right? And I think that would have been a better argument for them than to say that the shooting of Haile was more in self-defense because he was startled.
Yeah.
So I don't think that was a good application of that expert, but I do think it could have been interesting to hear.
Yeah. And I can't say for sure what the full testimony would have said and what it would have applied to. I just know that that was one of the examples, is that she was going to say that he would not have been able to hear Haile coming in because he was in this period of high stress.
Exactly. And, everybody's entitled to a rigorous defense. And so I will always give the defense a chance until they start making stupid arguments. Mm-hmm. So that's why I'm like, no, I think that expert could have been helpful to their defense. But similarly, I agree with the court of like, that person can still come in, but that doesn't change the initial killing and setup.
Right. And his final argument in his appeal was that there was prosecutorial misconduct during the closing argument, in that the court should have given the jury cautionary instruction as a result of this. Specifically, during the closing argument, the prosecution asked the jury to consider whether Haile said, "I'm sorry," on the recording after being shot. The court had previously asked the transcript of the recording to be changed from, quote, "I'm sorry," end quote, to, quote unquote, "unclear," as the court could not come to a definitive conclusion as to what was said. However, the appeals court said that because the prosecution was asking the jury to consider what was said, not saying that this was said, this did not meet the bar of prosecutorial misconduct, and thus the court did not need to give additional cautionary instruction. So, because the appeals court disagreed with his 4 arguments, his appeal was denied. However, he would challenge this decision by the Minnesota Supreme Court and would take the argument to the U.S. District Court for Minnesota in 2018, the U.S. Court of Appeals 8th Circuit in 2020, and finally the U.S. Supreme Court in 2021. In all of these cases, the courts affirmed the original decision by the Minnesota Supreme Court. Byron is currently serving out his sentence at the Oak Park Heights Correctional Facility in Stillwater, Minnesota. And to end the story with a brief note on the victims in this case, Nick and Haile were laid to rest on December 1st, 2012. Their funeral was attended by more than 400 people, and they are dearly missed by their family, friends, and loved ones. And that is the end of our story.
Well, friend, I have so many emotions and so many thoughts. I've gotten the vast majority of them out at this point. But the big one is that Byron is an evil, evil person who still thinks that he's in the right, who still sees nothing wrong with what he did, who thought the law was going to be on his side after he killed 2 people. I genuinely don't understand that. And obviously, you didn't think you were 100% in the right either, because what you need a lawyer for? Why do you need a lawyer and then want to go to the police unless you think you did something wrong?
I will say I will always advocate for people to have a lawyer when talking to the police.
I agree. I do think people should have a lawyer when they talk to the police. But the real situation is you really only need a lawyer once you're Mirandized.
And he was Mirandized pretty soon after the police came, because at the end of the day, I will say he killed 2 people. And even in cases where it was clear-cut self-defense, I think it would still make sense to have a lawyer because there is going to be some investigation into it.
Yeah, I guess I can be charitable, but in this case, I don't like it.
And that's fair.
So yeah, he's an evil person, and it just shocks me that so many people are still supportive of him and that people believe him and that he's getting street cred in prison, which that doesn't mean anything.
I will remind you, this is a small town in Minnesota.
Oh, I understand.
So it does not shock me.
I understand. But in that same vein, you don't get to set up saw traps and then act like you're a victim.
Right.
I don't think anybody would think that John Kramer is a victim.
Right. And I really think, though, the turning point is there are people who think that the punishment for committing any sort of crime above a certain level is death. And there are people who see people who commit those crimes as less than human. And I think because you have people who think that way, it does not surprise me that there are people who think he did nothing wrong.
You know what's interesting, friend, is in a lot of ways, I think that way. I do think there is a crime where you have lost your free trial for breathing. But that bar is so high that it is reserved for people who don't deserve to walk around any society. It's not for people who break into homes. It's not for burglary. It's not for, I don't care if somebody broke into a house and stole everything in there. A senseless death, a painful death is not the remedy. It's just not. And so that's why it's still concerning to me, because I understand that people can have that belief because I have a baseline for that belief, but I don't understand why your baseline is so low. That's the concerning part.
And I think it's because they see people who commit those crimes as less than human. And so then they don't think that they deserve all the protections that other people would. Even if their little nephew did something like that, they would still see him as different than those burglars, those robbers that they see on the news. I think that's also a big part of it, is demonization of these people. Yes, what they're doing is wrong, but sometimes the way that it's pitched in the news is they are less than human. How could somebody do something like this? When reality is people do have motivations, even if those motivations don't make sense to us. People do have motivations for committing crimes.
This is true. And I think also it's like when you've gotten to that point where you can just see somebody as less than human because they're on the other side of the screen, you lost the plot.
Yeah.
Like,
I think many people have lost the plot.
Oh, I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. But it still needed to be said.
Mm-hmm.
Because those same types of people are the people who don't believe in universal health care, don't believe in taking care of people who have fallen on hard times, whether they're homeless, whether they're fighting addictions, anything like that. Those are those same people, because They have made choices in their life to be like that. So why do I need to help them?
Right.
It's those same people with that same thinking.
And people also don't understand that your lack of support of those things actually is what's contributing to more crime. People not having healthcare, people going broke because they had one ER trip is what's contributing to these crime rates.
Yep. Crime and poverty go hand in hand. It's been proven year after year after year.
Exactly.
As we wrap up today's discussion, we're going to move into our segment called Today in Crime, where we'll describe a crime or crime-related event that took place on this day. So on September 5th, 1991, AIDS activists unfurl a giant condom over Senator Jesse Helms' home. On the sunny morning of September 5th, 1991, in the Washington, D.C. suburb of Arlington, Virginia, a group of activists arrive at the home of North Carolina Senator Jesse Helms. Using ladders, several of them climb to the roof of the house, and from there, they unfurl a giant piece of fabric, which is then inflated by their comrades on the front lawn. Soon, the senator's home is surrounded by a giant yellow condom, reading, quote, "A condom to stop unsafe politics. Helms is deadlier than a virus," end quote. A decidedly unsubtle response to Helms' vehement opposition to gay rights and to funding AIDS research and treatment. Then, in his third term in the Senate, Helms had established himself as Senator No, the most bombastic opponent of civil rights legislation, abortion, and HIV research in an already hostile Republican caucus. He considered homosexuals, quote, weak, end quote, and, quote, immorally sick, end quote, and believed that any legislation aimed at learning more about HIV/AIDS or developing treatments for the disease was tantamount to enabling the, quote, homosexual lifestyle, end quote. In the face of scientific consensus, he maintained that, quote, there is not one single case of AIDS in this country that cannot be traced in origin to sodomy, end quote. And he refused to speak with the mother of Ryan White, a teenager who died of AIDS after receiving a transfusion of HIV-positive blood, even when she cornered him in a Capitol Hill elevator. In response to politicians like Helms and the American government's general unwillingness to treat HIV/AIDS as the public health crisis it was, a group of LGBT organizers formed ACT UP, a grassroots group dedicated to forcing government action on the HIV/AIDS epidemic in 1987. Peter Staley, an ACT UP founder, formed the Affiliate Treatment Action Group, or TAG, in 1991. A short time later, he conceived of the giant condom. After requisitioning the condom from a novelty company in California and practicing its unfurling on a TAG member's lawn in New Platts, New York, a group of activists headed to Northern Virginia and draped Helms' home with the prophylactic on September 5th. Participants expected to be arrested, primarily after being confronted by angry neighbors, but they were allowed to go free after the police arrived and demanded they remove the condom. Helms was not home at the time, but the incident succeeded in garnering media attention across the country and in bewildering Helms' maid, who spent the morning trapped in the home, unable to leave until the condom was deflated. And that is what happened on this day. If you found this story interesting, please leave a rainbow flag emoji in the comments.
Any other thoughts, friends?
Just one. Why not make a statement with a giant condom? I find that hilarious.
I find that to be the best way to make a statement.
Absolutely.
We should make more statements with giant condoms.
I completely agree. I think this world would be a better place if there was more giant condoms over some politicians' homes.
I do wish there was a video of them putting it together. I don't know if there is. We didn't do that research. But if there is, please drop it in the comments.
Please do, because absolutely nothing would make my life better than if I had an image of this. Also, man, I will never understand people's direct denial of reality to just go against the LGBTQIA plus community.
Right.
I will just never understand it. We're going to deny actual facts so that I can prove my point.
And even in a case where a teenager got it from a blood transfusion, you still won't speak out on that and talk to his mother. Ridiculous, because it doesn't align with your assertion that everyone who has HIV got it from sodomy, in your words.
Yes, absolutely. And it's stupid and irritating, quite frankly. I'm just disappointed he wasn't home.
Yeah.
Could you imagine you wake up, you look out your window, and you're just like, what is this yellow haze?
Right. And then you're like, those words in the sky? What's going on?
Yeah.
And then you turn on the news and
it's your house.
Your house is covered in a condom. Yeah. I am mad that he wasn't home.
Dang.
That's the only note I have. Make sure he's home next time.
Absolutely. Make sure he's home.
But thank you to our listeners for joining us on this episode. I would especially like to thank Dateline, the Case Law website, and CBS News for providing most of the material for this episode. If you'd like to check out photos related to this case, follow us at Criminalish Podcast on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube.
Listeners, if you like what you hear, be sure to leave a 5-star review wherever you're listening to the Criminalish Podcast. And if you're listening on YouTube, be sure to subscribe to our channel and feel free to leave any comments or questions down below. As always, stay nosy, my friends. Bye.
Bye.